Good morning. I will introduce our next speakers. First, it's Professor Carlos Páramo. Graduated in anthropology at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. He holds a master's degree in social anthropology and a PhD in history from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. So please, Professor.
Good morning, and I wanted to say thank you again for this wonderful conference and trips and getting to know so many different places and peoples. I want to thank especially the university and Laura and Mariana, who've been the most wonderful friends and hostess during this trip, and also the Irish Embassy. I must excuse myself for my rather clumsy English sometimes. What I wanted to share with you is, in a sort of way, rather dissonant from what has been said during the last day and a half or so. It's obviously around Roger Casement. It's the basic theme, actually. I wanted to make, I think, an important precision. Casement is obviously an Irish character, an Irish hero, but in Colombia, we arrived rather early to finding out whom he was and his importance. We arrived to Roger Casement and his circumstances even before Michael Tausig did. And then Angus Mitchell and Seamus O'Shea-Kong. And the big corpus of literature that has sprang from their seminal works. We arrived to Roger Casement from the memories and finding out what had happened during the Putumayo genocide of the first decades of the 20th century, when an important number of indigenous societies were actually disappeared in every sense, and others, very much to our surprise, like a sort of miracle, again lived again, resurrected, really. We're talking about the Easter Rebellion, and the symbolism is very much at hand about the implications of resurrection at Easter. And these societies also resurrected almost from the ashes after the rubber genocide. And finding the survivors, sometimes the sons and daughters of men and women who had been enslaved by, not just by the Casa Arana, but by many rubber agencies, not just in the Putumayo, but also in other important sites, like the river Baupes and the river Vichala and the river Inírida, by other rubber agents and companies. Finding these survivors was a means to meditate on history, to meditate on the mechanisms to which they had resorted for living again. And then, in the whole of it, Roger Casement appeared. The importance of his report, the great influence that he exerted even in our literature, because we have one of the great classics of Colombian literature is the 1924 novel by José Eustacio Rivera, La Vorágine, a voragine, the vortex, which Luc already mentioned, and in which Professor Leopoldo is very much an authority. I've been working around that novel for a while now already. Also, Casement actually planted a sort of seed that would also bring out a national type of literature and an Latin American genre known as frontier literature, or even more precisely jungle literature. So, more to the point, I'm talking about Casement not really as just an Irishman, an Irish patriot, as a colonial agent or an anti-colonial one. I'm talking about Casement in a rather sort of a national way, as if he was someone that could really be considered as a sort of a Colombian citizen as well, because he really belongs to our history. But what can we do with these characters? What I will try to deliver is a rather different interpretation of him. I will use an excuse, but this excuse also involves a theory both on myth and on biography, even in autobiography. This is the main theme of Edward Elgar's famous variations on an original theme, Opus 36 from 1899. They were originally, the first time that they were performed was in St. James Hall in London, under the direction of Hans Richter, a very famous conductor then, one of the first modern conductors. This theme and variations, this musical theme with variations, became very widely known as the Enigma variations, because it isn't really clear to what theme are they variations to. The original theme is considered as a variation in itself of very different sources. Elgar was never clear, and he liked to play with what people thought they were variations to. Some said that the theme was a variation on Auld Lang Syne. Other people thought that they were variations on an ancient Lutheran hymn, Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott. Perhaps they are an original theme. And from this theme, Elgar composes 13 variations, which are portraits of his friends, men and women of local Worcester society. His friends are variations on the theme. The 14th theme, the final, climatic theme, is an autoportrait of Elgar himself. And as I said, here is implied a theory of myth and of biography. We all are themes. We are themes that are variated, that have their own variations in our relations, in our friends. But they also reflect in us. We are variations of our relations. We are made up, but by what we transform, but keep structurally constant from what we get from the others. This has been much a current theory of myth. from perhaps since Claude Lévi-Strauss or before, the myth is something that it's not really important what's the myth, the primeval myth. What is important is the capacity of a mythic structure to have constant variations. Some variations actually become themselves main themes. And sometimes when we think of some variations as variations, we find out that they are actually mythic themes, that we can only get to them as themes from examining the whole range of variations. But again, there is a theory of biography. And this theory implies that any biography, autobiography, is a game of reflections, as in a hall of mirrors, in which the subject is reflected on the other people, and the other people, his relations, reflect him. And I think there's a point to it to try to grasp this protean character that is Roger Casement. If I have time, I would talk a little bit about Vargas Llosa's famous now novel, The Dream of the Celt, which I don't really like. But he has a very interesting epigraph. We are one and many at the time. And this comes from a celebrated treaty essay by Jorge Enrique Rodó, Los Motivos de Proteo, the motives of Proteus. And Casement is really one and many at the same time. He is a man, he's a character that was subject and is still subject to many variations. And what I'm trying to aim at is that he himself constructed around the variations that his time, the symbols that as themes his time asked from him or put on him. So the enigma variations are a sort of way of trying to capture the enigma of Roger Casement. And perhaps the first variation could really be Elgar and Casement. Because there's a sort of subject and counter-subject in musical or rhetorical language that they could very well establish. Elgar is seen nowadays as perhaps not only the most important composer of 19th century and early 20th century Great Britain, but he's also seen as a sort of poet or musician laureate of the empire. His marches, pomp, and circumstance are used to exhaustion in movies that deal with Victorian themes, with imperial themes. And yet, Elgar was not particularly an apologist of empire. He didn't even like singing to empire, although he composed some pieces like the Crown of India Suite. His voice was rather the voice of an outsider. He was Catholic. He came from provincial Worcestershire. He came from a middle-class background, and all his life, he was an eccentric trying to procure the center, to be at the center, a literal eccentric trying to get to the center, trying to have a peerage. He became a baronet at the end of his days, etc. But his voice was really paradoxically that of an outsider. One could think that Casement was his direct opposite, but he also had a very strong feeling towards Catholicism. We don't really know if he was clandestinely baptized or not, but he became a Catholic in his later days. almost before being hanged in Pentonville, and he was also an eccentric in all sorts of ways. The first of one being an Irishman, even though he only became aware of being it along his life, but also trying to get to the center. Casement was a colonial agent, and if we contrasted Elgar with Casement, another paradox would come out, is that perhaps the colonial representative would be Roger Casement. The paradox is as well put in these terms. Casement was important. At least the Casement before 1912 was important because he was a colonial agent, because he was a representative of empire, because this gave him license and a voice to be heard for the Congo report, and more importantly, I think, for the Putumayo report, which is more prolix even. So these are paradoxes that I think can explain some of the contradictions within this enigma, within this Prothean figure as Roger Casement. After the appearance of his diaries, Casement became sort of represented as a sort of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde personality. There was a public Dr. Jekyll, which was the noble diplomat. And there was a dark side to him, the homosexual, the rebel, the outlaw, as Luke said. And it's a very potent symbolic interpretation of him, but it could also be said that there was not really such a duality in the case of Casement. But B.L. Reid in 1976 perhaps had a stronger point when, in a biography thus titled The Lives of Roger Casement, he insisted that there were two Casements, the British Casement and the Irish Casement, and that for a long while, they cohabited. I would go even further. I think that the Irish Casement really appeared after he passed through the Putumayo. It's like a sort of jungle history, perhaps coming from the universe of one very, very interesting Uruguayan author that also wrote about the jungle in those times, that was Horacio Quiroga. Perhaps he was sort of bitten, stung by something in the jungle that made this Irish savage grow within himself. And when he was sailing towards England to make his report in a metaphorical sort of way, really, obviously, this Irish fellow was growing beneath his skin, and he began to peel. He began to find this being that was inhabiting him. So there's a theme and a counter theme. We could even say that Luke has shown us this, and I think that's brilliant, that James Joyce could also be interpreted as a variation of the theme, on the implied theme of being eccentric, of being in the center, of what means being in the center, or what means being eccentric. But I would make an emphasis on Casement's colonial personality as well. And I tend to disagree with what I would think is rather exaggerated sometimes about Casement's actual grasp of the Putumayo situation. I think he really did not go very much far from imperial solutions, in a sense. He has a very emblematic discussion with a robber baron who is a very colorful character, a Maltese Jew named Victor Israel in 1910, as they navigate along the Putumayo on one of Arana's, oh no, perhaps this was Booth's boat, the Huayna. And they discuss about the Putumayo, and Casement writes in his diary that he really thinks that the model for handling the Putumayo would be a British model. And then his alternative in the report was to bring Irish missionaries. He stressed much on the Irishness of the missionaries, but still he believed really in the missionary model. And there's a very interesting memoir by one of the missionaries. He wasn't Irish, he was Argentinian, but he came with the Irish mission, Father Alberto Gridilla. And what turns out is that they really didn't understand the context. They were really, they had very strong cultural apprehensions that made that enterprise, that missionary enterprise, really not worthwhile. But let's pass to the other variation. Let's say that's variation number 3. Casement, besides being a colonial agent, was a colonial hero. And he was a colonial hero in a complex way. It's very interesting how he was regarded by some of his contemporaries and his close associates, such as Pulteney Bigelow, who wrote about African colonialism in other places of Africa. And Pulteney Bigelow said that Casement was the type of man that appears in Jules Verne's novel, a man of action, but also an intellectual, someone that's not afraid to go through the confines of the world by a blend of science, technology, romance, and adventure. Casement represented all those themes, all those subjects. He was a hero for his time. And so it says a lot that when Pulteney Bigelow said that, when Jules Verne was one of the most influential authors of the West, Casement would be represented as a Vernian hero, because Vernian heroes are all that, but they also are complex characters, more complex than one would think, really. All Vernian heroes have a secret. Some are actual travestites. They are women posing as men to do their adventures. Some are really have psychopathic tendencies, like Phileas Fogg. Some are obsessive, as Professor Otto Lindenbrook in Journey to the Center of the Earth. Some are quite revengeful, such as Captain Nemo. Some are victims to hubris, like Rover, the Conqueror. Vernian heroes are always lonely people. They always have a secret that until the last minute they will reveal. And that's the case for this 1880 novel about the Amazon. La Jangada, the original title, is in Spanish, 800 Leagues by the Amazon. It's a novel that actually occurs from Iquitos to Belém do Pará, that has a part in Manaus. I forgot to say, one of the reflections of Elgar in Casement was that Elgar actually went to Manaus in 1924. He arrived there, he stayed at Teatro Amazonas. He was very impressed by the theater. He was considering writing an opera when we returned from Manaus. He never got to it, actually. And this also gives a very important place to Manaus and the river, but what actually happens in La Jangada is the story of a floating island along the Amazon, an island of let us say, a sort of political correctness of civilization, of human rights as understood in the 19th century, of fair dealings with the natives. And his main character, the main character of the novel, is João Garral, who carries a secret very much as a sort of reflection of Edgar Allan Poe's The Golden Bug. So he also carries a secret, and he wants to make justice when he gets to the Atlantic. He's going to make a revelation, something that's going to turn things over. And that's very Vernian, and that's Casement as well. Getting to the Atlantic to make a revelation, to turn things upside down. But obviously, the other character is Captain Nemo. He also is within a floating island. But in this case, it's not floating as much as submerged. It's an underwater ark, a sort of Noah's Ark for the 19th century. It's a place where all civilization is compacted, a library with the great and important titles of humanity, a gallery. He has an organ in which he plays the great masterpieces of civilization. But Nemo is an anti-colonial character. He is a Hindu prince, originally named Prince Dakar. When he acquires the name Nemo, that's very interesting because Nemo obviously means no name. He is a no man's man. He hasn't have a name. And Captain No Name, Captain Nemo, is really a warrior against imperialism. After his family was killed during the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, he swore vengeance on the empire. And everywhere he sees, he spies a British ship, he will drown it ruthlessly, regardless of what the ship carries. When the other main character of the novel, ichthyologist Pierre Aronnax, is really struck by Nemo's cold blood, he even calls him an archangel of death. And Nemo replies saying, I am really not hindered by what you think of me, because I always put myself in place of the oppressed. When they are looking at a pearl fisher who risks his life to go to the bottom of the sea for a pearl, and he sees how thin he is, how poor he is, how oppressed he is, he tells Aronnax, I am him. And this is interesting because in a way, Nemo is putting himself in that man's shoes. He is preparing the theme of seeing that man from the eyes of another race. But he is a warrior. He's a sort of sea guerrilla fighter. He's not a pirate. He doesn't benefit from the spoils of the ships. He just wants to drown them, to sink them. And this illustration from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea from 1871, it's very interesting because it gives us also the iconographical side. This is Captain Nemo going out of his famous submarine, the Nautilus. If we could abstract this image from its context, we could very well be looking at Roger Casement descending from a U-19 boat in Charlie Bay. Although we know that Casement didn't have his emblematic beard then. And I will really stress the point that Casement's symbolic efficacy is around his beard. His beard gives him an epic personality. The beard is more important, it's not just a circumstantial thing. The beard constructs an iconography of Casement as a warrior, as a knight gallant, perhaps as a sort of paradoxical conquistador, as a guerrilla fighter. He has the same beard of Fidel Castro, if you'd like, of the original Fidel Castro of Sierra Maestra, and they were very famous because they were the barbados, the barbudos. It even got into the French language. The barbudos were the original guerrillas, the heroic guerrillas. With a shorter beard, it's Che Guevara, but it could also be Jesus as well. The beard is very iconical, and it's very revelatory. I think that he cut his beard. He wanted he wanted not to be too conspicuous when he landed. And I think one of the tragedies of his trial was that his beard was too short. He grew his beard desperately. He wanted to appear with that beard as a sort of, and I'm not making a joke, I do think on the efficacy of these altar images. It was his beard was akin to Samson's hair in a way. He had to grow it because he had to make a point about himself during the trial. Thus, Nemo and Vernian heroes are the very complicated blend of a heroic side and a dark side, the revengeful side, the obsessive side. There could also be other characters as well that reflect Casement. The most famous of them, and I will not go very much into detail with him, is obviously Kurtz, the emblematic Kurtz of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We heard yesterday about Casement's emblematic meeting with Conrad in Matari, that has so very poetically and perceptibly studied by Siebold that Luke just mentioned in his Rings of Saturn. What I would stress more, because I think it has not really been so much treated, is that the usual version tends to see Casement as an inspirer of Conrad. That what he told him about the Congo gave Conrad a frame to understand the Congo, and that he repaid his debt to Casement in a way by writing Heart of Darkness. You could even think that Casement was actually the model for Kurtz in a way. Oh, he could tell you things, said Conrad, writing to Robert Montingham Cunningham Graham, who was staying in Argentina, about Casement. And that was almost the same thing that was said about Kurtz. Oh, he could tell you things. He had this charisma, this capability of saying things that should not be said. But I think Casement repaid his debt to Conrad, because Conrad supplied Casement also with a frame and actually with a scheme, in the sense of Edmund Gombrich and of Friedrich Bartlett. He provided Casement with a scheme in which he could understand some characters of the Casa Arana, and most of all, Armando Normand, a Bolivian agent that worked for the Aranas, which was an accountant that had studied in London, which was also a representative of civilization when he arrived at the Putumayo after recruiting the Barbadians in 1904, in which Casement had really a fix on him. He was obsessed by Normand. He saw in Normand a snake, a representative of evil, actually. He called him an absolute monster, in fact. He labeled Normand as the absolute monster. And all the metaphors he uses is like he meeting Mr. Kurtz. He's reproducing, I think, his experience of having reading Heart of Darkness. We positively know that Casement read Heart of Darkness at least one time. And he's repaying his debt to Conrad by molding Normand on the Kurt's theme, which is a variation on the Casement theme. Thus, it's interesting that perhaps Casement's obsession with Normand, I really do think so, came out of seeing in Normand someone very much like himself. Normand was what Roger Casement would have been had he stayed in the jungle. Someone who got out, who went off the boat, as Conrad said. Someone who really was cut his ties to civilization, to culture. And I think because that was an intuition on how the jungle could get the best part of you. And that's an obsession in Conrad as well. Not only in Heart of Darkness, but in an outpost of civilization, etc. But the other interesting thing is that Casement reflected himself in Normand by a quite paradoxical situation. We could see in Roger Casement a man of many faces, a multifaceted man. Armando Normand had no face at all. And in that sense, being the exact opposite, he was just like Chesterton's Sunday. You could really not describe him. And until now, we don't have a photograph of Armando Normand. He is perhaps the only one of Arana's criminals that we don't really know how it looked. He was described by Casement, though. And it's ironical that the only grasp we have of Casement's facial identity came from Casement. He said that he has gross lips, he has greasy and very round eyes, and that he resembled an East End Jew, which means that Casement could also be very schematic and even racist when put into some corners. Because he really had an image of the East End Jew as a sort of prototypic villain. If we mix Casement's description of Normands with what we know about Normand, we could even provide a theory on how Normand looked. This is La Guarida de los Asesinos, the Assassin's Den. It was published by Ricardo Sanchez, also in 1924. Ricardo Sanchez worked for the Aranas. He worked for Casement, for Normand, sorry. It was a very interesting lapsus. He worked for Normand, and this is a very interesting memoir, a very bloody memoir about his time working with the Casa Arana. But what I find interesting is the character with the machete. I think this could very well be Armando Normand. I think this is a possibility. He just might be the man with no face. But then, if we compare him with Casement's description, he just seems rather like this other character. Villainous looking and repulsive face, seemed like a loathsome reptile. And this is Fagin, coming from Oliver Twist, from Dickens. So Casement also works on these literary types, on these literary themes that becomes variations around him. Let's go to the other one. This is the theme about the call of the jungle. And that's Normand, and that's in a sense Captain Nemo. And it's a prototypical, an emblematic type of the Amazon, Lope de Aguirre. He became very famous with Werner Herzog's film of 1970, Aguirre, The Wrath of God, Aguirre, La Zone Waters. And this illustration comes from 1911, from the first edition of Las Inquietudes del Chanti Andía, The Concerns of Chanti Andía, written by Basque author Pío Baroja. This is an illustration made by Baroja's brothers, Ricardo. And this is Lope de Aguirre. But who is this Lope de Aguirre? it really resembles Roger Casement. It has also the beard, but it also reminds us that Casement was compared not only to a knight, to a gallant knight, but also that Conrad had said before that he had something of the conquistador in him. That he had something of a Pizarro or of a Cortés. And what else is an errant knight in the Amazonian jungle but a conquistador? So it's really striking that when we go to Leticia, which is Colombia's main harbor on the Amazon, we go to the Orellana Park, which celebrates Francisco de Orellana, the official discoverer of the Amazon, and we find this bust. Local legend has it that it is Casement. And even if it would not be modeled on Casement, it really resembles him. Roger Casement is here reflected as a conquistador, and the conquistador reflects Casement, but it also reflects Lope de Aguirre. And who is Lope de Aguirre? Lope de Aguirre is the prototypical traitor. He is the madman in the jungle. But he has also a point. He's a sort of diabolical genius. He was also called in the colonial representations of Aguirre as an archangel of death, just like Nemo was called by Pierre Aronnax in 20 Leagues Under the Sea. And yesterday I heard something that was I really liked. I think it was Aurelio who said it, about the lone wolf. Lope de Aguirre, and it hasn't been really said, I said it in my book about Aguirre. When you translate literally the name Lope de Aguirre, it means wolf of the steppes, Steppenwolf, in fact, just like Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf. He is a lonely wolf. So it is interesting because it's a lonely wolf, and the lonely wolf is Lope de Aguirre, but it also could be, and was applied yesterday, to Roger Casement. But the basic theme is the jungle as hell. Aguirre becomes himself, is represented as a sort of demon, a playful demon if you would like. But he's a sort of demon. And because the jungle is represented as a hell. It's a sort of alternative inferno. And the place of the jungle is really very much akin to the place where Virgil travels in the Aeneid, and he takes Dante then in the place where Heart of Darkness occurs, but also the ocean and the desert, the wasteland, in fact. And I think the theme of the wasteland, that could also be no man's land according to the Great War's language, it's something that really could represent not only the spirits of the times, but Casement's soul as well. And I'm using the word soul advertently. And this theme of the jungle as hell, very much famous in Brazilian literature, at least in Brazilian Amazonian literature, through Alberto Rangel's novel of 1908, which was very much influential in Rivera's Vortex of 1924, also appears as a variation in Arthur Conan Doyle's 1912, The Lost World. This is the prehistoric, this prehistoric scenario that occurs in the Brazilian and Guyanan Roraima is a place where time got frozen. A place full of dinosaurs and flying apes and oppressed people. Is all an Eden, and it's also a hell. And the main characters are this lot. Perhaps this is one of the first instances of photography being used in a novel. It's just the frontispiece of The Lost World. They are impersonating characters, but this is actually a photograph. It's not an engraving. Conan Doyle asked some friends to pose for the photographs, and then they were used as models for the inward illustrations for the Strand magazine. And there's quite an irony here, because one of the characters, the narrator, in fact, is Edward Malone. Malone is a man of action, he's a journalist, he's the prototypical Irishman. On the other side, there's Lord John Roxton, the typical English squire, also a man of action, and he has recently come from making guerrilla war on what would really be said could be the Casa Arana. He has been fighting slavers in the Putumayo, and he had a personal war against Pedro Lopez, which is actually Armando Norman. There's no doubt about it. I think Doyle was really making a sort of irony, a fine irony, when he represented Casement as the typical English squire against Malone. Lord John Roxton, he was telling Casement as well, you do have some things of an English lord, but also because this Lord John Roxton, this is the illustration from the Stand magazine, also has a dark side. He's a man of action, he's very much cast in the Vernian mold, but when he gets his hands on a rifle and starts organizing Indians against laborers, he just can't stop. He's fascinated with guns. In fact, he leads to massacre. He is a perpetrator of massacres as well, because he is so enthusiastic about the use of guns. So he has he develops a theme that also is very dramatically represented in a scene in The Lost World when Lord John Roxton becomes, in fact, a god for the natives. Like Aguirre, like Kurtz. And this could be very well make a dialogue with the secret of England's success as shown, of England's greatness, as shown by Luke. He's not giving the Bible, he's carrying his rifle. And this is the Bible in one hand, rifle on the other hand, a sort of dichotomy of empire. I have very little time, so I will try to rush on. These are contemporary illustrations. We don't know if they couldn't possibly have influenced one another. And it's really striking how Lord John Roxton from 1912 resembles Lope de Aguirre from 1911. They could really be copies one of the other. But what's very much interesting is that Aguirre and Lord John Roxton, though they have a rather dissimilar beard, are also variations of Casement, because we know that Lord John Roxton was based on Roger Casement. But there's the other Doylean character. I have to run with this. Casement talks about his Sherlock Holmes soul, his Sherlock Holmes soul. He appropriates the character. He thinks of himself as Sherlock Holmes in the Putumayo. Doyle made a comment about Irish nationalism in one of Sherlock Holmes' later stories, his Last Bow from 1970s, but I would have liked to develop it more, but if we have Sherlock Holmes, we have Jack the Ripper. Because they cohabit in a world where there's also a thesis and an antithesis. And Jack the Ripper is the proverbial enemy of Sherlock Holmes, even though Doyle never put them together. What literature rapidly did, popular literature, was to put Sherlock Holmes against Jack the Ripper. But then there came the most convincing thing, that was that perhaps Sherlock Holmes was Jack the Ripper, or Jack the Ripper was Sherlock Holmes. There were two complementary sides. If Roger Casement had a Sherlock Holmes, we could well say, in a metaphorical way, that he could have a Jack the Ripper side, an obscure soul, perhaps when we understand it from the polemics around the diaries of Jack the Ripper. I'm not saying that Casement had a Ripper-like brain, but it's what the Ripper theme provides to the discussion. The thing about whom he was and what diaries he kept We know that the diaries, the Reaper's diaries nowadays are probably faked, and Angus Mitchell made a very stimulating article comparing the diaries of Jack the Ripper and with the diaries of Roger Casement, and considering context, cultural context, national, political context, as schemes, also frames of interpretation that could really not show objectively what the diaries were about. But what I would argue was that he really was possessed by a savage soul, Casement, but his savage soul was not that soul. It was the other instances of savage as it appears in the Oxford edition of the Oxford English Dictionary that appeared by the time in 1908, which provided 2.5 pages to the definitions of savage, and this was this type of savage, not the wild, crazy savage, but the native, the local native, the original inhabitant, the indigenous inhabitant of a place. I think Casement found out that he was possessed by this savage. This also appears in his diaries and in his Amazon journal, and this is a modern representation of Casement against Arana, made by an indigenous plastic artist, an Okaina Witoto woman, also a poetess who died recently, Anastasia Kandre. And it's very interesting because of all the iconography. Casement is shown as an Indian. He has a sort of totem-like protection in an elephant that he has carried from the Congo, and he is facing Arana, whose totem is a snake. Arana is dressed as a white man. Casement is dressed as an Indian, and it shows the incorporation of Casement in local culture, considered as one of us. Not one of us as Westerners, but one of us as an Indian, and thus it is a development of the idea of the white Indians of Ireland and of the Irish Putumayo as well. What is the relationship with this chivalrous, melancholical figure and this one? I think there are really many Casements, but we're not very much accustomed nowadays to regarding Casement in this sense, from this 1936 engraving by Harry Carnot, Casement at the Docks. I find this engraving very stimulating to think about Casement because there's a duplicity in the figure. We don't know really how his eyes are there. We don't know if he's gazing at us as a desperate sort of possessed being, or if he's just with his he's really not, he has his eyes closed and he's in meditation like a martyr, like a saint. They're both of them. They both inhabit him. They both show him in this light. And I think this is really the duplicitous enigma of Roger Casement. Thank you.